Now, I think our scribbling here has given us a little bit of a head start in how to work with tools and how to work with the objects, but there's one very important topic that we want to cover before we move on, and that is how these objects interact with each other. As I've drawn things, I've kind of taken care to keep things separated from one another, but now I'm going to start mixing things up. I'll start by moving back to my normal selection tool, and let me just single click to select this shape over here in the corner. You can see that the one click selected almost all of the shape. And that means this closed portion of the shape is currently one continuous curve segment. If I grab my pencil tool and draw a line that crosses right over that original stroke, and we go back to our selection tool and do the same thing, you'll notice that my original shape has been broken up into pieces right where my new line intersects the old one. You can even see that the new line we've drawn has been broken up also right where it crosses the original stroke. What we're seeing here are the effects of drawing in merge mode, and that basically means my lines are going to merge together to form one solid object. Now, merge sounds like they'd be joining instead of splitting, but that splitting action is exactly what you'll see any place you have objects intersecting one another. Let's draw a line across one of the shapes that we have. You probably wouldn't be surprised to find that if we went back and selected the shape, it's also been cut into two pieces. Even more interesting is how shapes interact with one another. So let's grab this shape down here. I'm just going to single click so I select the fill in this oval, and I'm going to move it over so that it intersects with both the line and the fill of the shape below it. Now, when you have things selected, they're kind of in a suspended state, so they don't do any cutting. But as soon as you click away from it, it's going to merge with the elements underneath it. And what that means in this case is if I move this yellow oval away from the blue, you'll see that it's cut out portions of both the stroke and the fill that was underneath it. This behavior is kind of the normal mode for Flash. In fact, even when you're selecting things, I can just use the normal selection tool and click and drag a marquee, and you'll notice that the objects that were selected are actually exactly the items that were inside the marquee. And I've actually created a split between my objects just by selecting. Now, I'm just going to undo that change since it made a big mess out of all my shapes. And next, let's take a look at ways that we can prevent this merge behavior from happening. There's one easy way to prevent it, and that is by using groups. So let's start there. I'm going to remove this cross line and the outline by double-clicking and hitting delete. And you'll notice that my split shape has actually joined itself back together at that point. And what I'd like to do is go up to Modify, and just choose Group with that selected. First of all, a group is going to appear differently. You can see that it has a bounding box outline instead of that crosshatch selection shape that we saw before. So you can easily tell when you're working with a group or a group type object. What's also interesting is when I move this shape around and intersect it with other shapes, even when I click away, it's not going to be cutting apart the other shapes. So my group is basically held separate from the other shapes. I don't have much control over the group. You can see that I just have position and size inside of my property window. So if I want to make changes to the shape of the vector or the colors, I would have to edit the group itself, and I do that by double-clicking on the group. The group indicator shows up in our toolbar indicating that we are working on a group that's inside of Scene 1, and you can see that all my other shapes have dimmed out and are not selectable while I'm working in group mode. Inside the group, everything works just as it did before. We can reshape the object, select it, change the color, and basically do whatever we want. If you're finished with the group, you can either click back on Scene 1 or use the blue back arrow to back up to whatever is before it, in this case Scene 1. And we're right back where we were before. Now at the beginning of this chapter, I mentioned using one of the tool settings called Drawing Mode. So what I'd like to do is take a look at that next. I'm going to go back to my pencil tool, and the first selection down in my option panel allows me to switch to Object Drawing Mode. Basically what that'll do is take me out of Merge Drawing Mode, and it's another way to keep my objects from intersecting and interfering with each other. Whenever you have object drawing turned on, like I do right now, anything I draw with the tool, we'll do a little scribble with my pencil tool, basically gets automatically grouped. In this mode, each drawing becomes its own little group, and you won't have any of that cutting behavior that we saw before. Let me just use my selection tool. I'll move this new object over top of one of my old ones, click away from it, and you can see that my bottom object has not been cut apart like it was before. Let me click on this and move it back up to the top. Now in the property panel it shows that it's a drawing object, and it actually allows you to make a few changes while you're working with it. For instance, I could change the stroke color, or I could increase the thickness. And just like a group, if you double click on it, you can go inside that drawing object and reshape it just like you would any other normal object. We get back out of the object the same way by clicking on Scene 1 of the back button. And interestingly enough, if you go up to the Modify menu, you can use Ungroup and turn it right back into a normal object just like the other elements that we've drawn. Now basically it's your choice. Each one of the tools that we've looked at has the ability to have object drawing turned on. And you'll notice that if it's turned on once, it stays on for the rest of the tools that we're working with until you turn it off. Well, so far our scribbles haven't created anything too pretty, at least mine haven't, but we've learned how to create and work with shapes inside of the Flash environment. So in our next chapter, we're going to take what we've learned and we're going to create a typical Flash scene.